Welcome to a special edition of Laid Back History for Juneteenth 2022. In this edition, we thought we'd provide an overview of the Waller-McDonald collection of African American history. And of course, we're coming to you from the historic Francis Julius Lemoyne House, which is a National Historic Landmark for the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad, a perfect setting for talking about the history of the African American community in Southwestern Pennsylvania. So the goal of the Waller-McDonald collection of African American history is to tell the entire history of African Americans in Southwestern Pennsylvania, and in a larger sense, the entire history of the region through the lens of the African American experience. So in order to properly do that, we have to tell the bitter along with the sweet, and we are in the process of building a resource that this community can use in the future to explore this very rich history. So what we have here today is just the tangible sampling of this collection. So the collection will be in the form of different media. It will include video, it will include audio, it will include digitized resources, and it will include tangible resources, not only paper, but photographs, artifacts, and other things that help tell the story of the African American experience here in Southwestern Pennsylvania. So what you see here is just a very, very small portion of what will ultimately be a very, very valuable collection. So let me just show you some of these things. And again, we'll go roughly chronologically, but this collection really originates in time with the inception of African Americans coming to this area of Southwestern Pennsylvania. So as early as the 1770s, we have indications of African Americans here in this area. And of course, nearly all of them, if not all, were enslaved at that time. So in order to understand from a perspective, we need to know something about the slave trade. And for example, we have resources like this book here that tells a little bit about the Transatlantic slave trade. And we have other information about early settlers to this area who came in some cases with enslaved people from areas such as the Chesapeake area of Maryland, the Tidewater area of Virginia, other areas in Western Maryland and Western Virginia. So we have lists of enslaved people who came and settled in this area. We also know that enslaved people helped build the early town of Washington. And to this day, there is evidence of structures that were built up on Walnut, for example, that were originally houses that were built by enslaved people, and later that, of course, formed the core of the African American community in the Third Ward. But again, in order to understand it, we have to go back to the earliest history of migration to this area. So an interesting piece of documentation that we have is a list of enslaved people that was part of the county records. And this is not an original, it's a transcription. The original of this register is kept in the archives at W&J. But this is a very, very useful tool to help us understand, who the earliest African American residents in this area were. And we have names, not surnames in most cases, but we have given names, and with enough research we can track some of these people into freedom, and that is really rewarding when we can do that. So additionally, we have lists that are broader than just Washington County or Southwestern Pennsylvania. This is a list of slave owners in Pennsylvania. So again, these resources, while they evoke a very painful past, they're indispensable for helping us tell the story of the community in general. So, a large part of the Waller-McDonald collection is actual data and lists that will promote and make possible future research. So historically, coming forward, after the period of enslavement ended in the late 1700s and early 1800s, we then have a period of activism beginning in the War of 1812 era. And of course, Dr. Lemoyne here is prominently known as a abolitionist and an activist, but there were many African Americans as well. And we're working to build the collection here of black abolitionists here in southwestern Pennsylvania. So for those, to identify those people, we often look to church membership. And we have the early membership lists, for example, for the First Methodist Church here in Washington, which was the basis of the formation of the first AME congregation here in Washington. And we have those lists here as part of our collection. So these, we also have some items that are in our collection from the larger abolitionist movement. For example, I'm not going to take these out of their protective envelopes to show you, but we have an example of the Anti-Slavery Almanac from 1838. We have some letters to Catherine Beecher, and I am presuming that it's the same Beecher as Harriet Beecher Stowe, who came from a family of abolitionists. We have a copy of Margaret McCulloch's book on Dr. Francis Julius Lemoyne, Fearless Advocate of the Right. So again, these sources, while maybe not directly related to the development of the African American community, must be considered to have a complete history. So then we come even further in time into the development of the Underground Railroad movement. And just briefly, the Underground Railroad movement was more than just the mythology of tunnels and trapdoors. It was a social movement. And taken together, the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad were collectively the first civil rights movement in United States history, and very, very interesting to study. And we just have just a sampling of resources here to show you. So we have a history of the Underground Railroad written in 1898 by Wilbur Siebert. We have Dr. Tom Mainwaring's book, specific to Washington County, called Abandoned Tracks. Gives a very, very useful history of the free black community and how the development of AME churches helped form the roadbed, if you will, for the Underground Railroad. And we have some subject matter files and some, individual people who were described. We have a file on Harriet Tubman, so miscellaneous clippings about Harriet Tubman that may be of interest to, younger researchers. We have a detailed history of the Underground Railroad by William Still, who was, as you may know, a very active Underground Railroad man in Philadelphia. And just general collections of articles in vertical files on the Underground Railroad. So, the Underground Railroad was itself kind of a culmination of the earlier civil rights activism of the early 1800s. And then we get into the Civil War era. So what we have here is just a sampling of some of our collections pertaining to African Americans and the Civil War. So here, some of you may recall that we had introduced this photograph of an unknown United States colored troops soldier that we have a photograph of. And this photograph was, we believe, in the late 1800s or early 1900s when this gentleman was attending a reunion, a Civil War reunion. So, again, the Waller-McDonald collection, one of the goals is to collect, all different types of things, documents, photographs, and we're very, very intrigued always by photographs because they help us tell a story. So here we have a set of vertical files that are lists of African Americans who served in the United States colored troops. And these lists were assembled by historians such as Marlene Bransom and Ronald Palmer. And they cover not only Washington County, but Greene County, Allegheny County. And we find that the rosters and lists of the United States colored troops are very, very valuable to genealogists because oftentimes we can locate some type of a discharge file or a pension file based on the soldier's Civil War service. And we also here at the Historical Society take an interest in knowing where United States colored troop soldiers' final burial places are. And for example, we are very interested in the cemetery at Payne Chapel AME Church in Canonsburg, which is the final resting place for several of these soldiers. So the Civil War era has given us a lot of very, very interesting information. So as we progress into the late 19th century and early 20th century, there is even more information that comes into our collection. And we get into things that we have discussed on Laid Back History in the past, such as Black-owned businesses. We can get into the early athletic teams that were active in the late 1800s, early 1900s, baseball and then basketball, etc. And that brings us into the era of the modern civil rights movement, through Jim Crow and into, say, the 40s, when we the first indications of true progress in terms of integration of the military, and later integration of public spaces like the Washington Park swimming pool in the early 1960s. So our collection then is able to encompass things like the Oral History Project that was conducted in 2010. And this binder is the culmination of that project. It was conducted through the Washington County History and Landmarks Foundation and also Washington Jefferson College. And this binder is transcriptions of a number of oral history interviews that were conducted at that time. And here we have just a couple of samples of the audio from those interviews. We have an audio of Myra Campbell, who was one of the Freedom Swimmers that helped integrate Washington Park Pool in the early 60s, and also our good friend Lorraine Walls Perry. So lots of very interesting insights as to the growth and progress within the African American community. We have some modern day books that talk about specific areas, geographic areas of interest. For example, West Middletown. We have this great book on the Kelly family and other families in West Middletown. Great resource. And since we're trying to develop the history of African Americans, not only here in Washington and not only Washington County, but also regionally, we're collecting these books like this, that tell about history in Monongalia County, West Virginia. Again, very useful. So, again, coming forward in time, we are assembling, and we talked about this in one of our previous episodes, lists of African American businesses. Dean Ellis was kind enough to provide this list that he assembled on African American businesses from about the 1950s forward. We have this photograph here. We're looking to get a better copy of this photograph, but it shows early African Americans on the Washington police force. We have articles about business, and for example, Lew Waller, a prominent businessman, a leader, civic leader, and of course the name which represents the Waller-McDonald collection, along with James Cookie McDonald, who himself became a civic leader, himself followed Lew Waller in involvement in the NAACP as president of the NAACP, and himself was an advocate for integration of workplaces, a real champion of equal employment opportunities for African Americans. But it's also important to realize that Lew Waller and Jim McDonald had those who came before them and who also worked very, very hard to achieve these opportunities. And perhaps they didn't have the success that Lew Waller and Jim McDonald had, but they were chipping away at the same objective. So here we have an example of a very interesting letter that was donated to us recently that pertains to the lobbying for equal employment opportunities for African Americans at Jessup Steel. And this letter, we believe, was in early 1942. The group that actually authored this letter, we believe the writer of the letter was Quinn Banks, who was an early advocate for opportunities in the workplace. So as the collection gains momentum, and as the public becomes more aware of what we're trying to do here, we hope that we will get more information like this that will tell us more about the history of social reform in this area. And of course, that's part of the mission of the Historical Society, is to tell that story. And we bring it all the way to the present day by collecting and documenting things that are happening in the present. So this, for example, is the program for the Soulful Roots reunion that occurred last year, and it's going to join our collection along with all of these other very interesting artifacts. So going back to the statement that I made at the beginning, what you see here is just a small, very small fragment of the entire collection as it exists today, and it will, be paled in comparison as to what we believe this collection can grow into. Our digitized resources to date occupy a very, very large chunk of computer storage space right now. And I can't really tangibly show that to you, but it is an enormous body of information. And we're only going to expand further, and we ask you, the viewers, to please let us know if there are things that you think would be helpful to this effort to build this collection and to build this resource for our future generations. So I hope you've enjoyed this brief overview of the Waller-McDonald collection of African American history, which we bring to you in celebration of Juneteenth 2022. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Laid Back History. Thank you.